It's great to be here. It was absolutely wonderful to hear Mr. Martin actually say, we did something wrong, we fixed it. We don't hear that anymore in political discourse in this country. And it really was an illuminating part of the session that I was at to see an organization like this that is so, I hate to use the word professional when you're talking about for profit, but that has its act together so well. Now, I seem to have been dressed for the meeting with the judge as opposed to prof clothes, but I'll endeavor to persevere anyway. First of all, those are very kind words about my book on George McCulloch. It was probably the hardest piece of history writing I've ever done, partly because his wife was not really thrilled with his departure from this mortal coil and burned his papers before she married his sort of best frenemy. And so I had to actually reconstruct his papers. And I'm going to get into the issues that we're going to see in terms of training people to have the ability to do that kind of work, that kind of research work. And so it's sort of a good link. My next book is a biography of Jean de Brebeuf, but really what it is a discussion of contact between Indigenous Canada, themselves as Canada, Indigenous people in the Great Lakes Basin, and Jesuit missionaries who planned to basically put together something very similar to the reduction system in Paraguay, which was a Jesuit-run nation that actually had a Jesuit-trained army and had minority people as peasants, and they almost pulled it off. Also, Father Brebeuf had this deep urge for martyrdom, and that was accommodated quite well by his hosts. And so if you want to know how somebody can really end up in a bad way, Father Brebeuf ends up in about the worst way possible. And then the book ends with me actually being at the Martyr Shrine, which is up in Midland, about an hour and a half drive from here, watching Pope John Paul II pray over the skull of Jean de Brebeuf and talking about, like, what constitutes success when things go terribly, terribly wrong for everybody, including the Huron people. And I want to, before I give this talk, I want to say that it's very easy for people who are historians and people who are interested in history to get very down about the current situation, because it really stinks, frankly. And but I think that everything I'm going to touch on is fixable. And so it then enters the world of human action. And in this world, things can be done. And in an organization like this, where you have people who are thoughtful and well-read and knowledgeable of the issues, plus of the system itself, and probably a few people here at least have some knowledge of how to do some sort of lobbying or at least expression to government and funding agencies, there's a lot that people in organizations like this can do. There are also things that people in media can do, and there's things that people like us who interact with media, even as subscribers, can do to try and revive really what we had as a healthy book industry in Canada. So the Radisson book, we sold quite a few copies of that book because I think it touched nerves, because I think contact, especially the idea of contact, has never been explored. It's been explored by brilliant people, but it's never been explained very well. And when I think of like Bruce Trigger at McGill, Connor Heidenreich at U of T, there's nothing more masterly in Canada in terms of discussion of the Huron than Bruce Trigger's Children of Atensik and the other books that he did that didn't get quite as much attention. And I really wanted to take this story and to tell it. And there are only two biographies of Jean de Brebeuf, and they're both written by Jesuits. So maybe there was an opportunity to tell that story. And the Radisson story connected because you had a very sympathetic person who move freely through these two worlds of indigenous societies and European societies. Now, as you read the book, if you ever do, you'll be asking yourself this question: why isn't this guy dead yet? Why hasn't someone finally put a spike into this man's head? And he, I'm not going to ruin it for you, but he doesn't end up like Brebeuf. And I was very intrigued by the idea of mutually beneficial trade and business between the indigenous people and the early fur trade, and why people on both sides of that trading wanted things in many ways. They didn't want technologically things to stay the same, but certainly it wasn't a colonial project. I mean, there was nothing to be gained by forcing indigenous people off their land when they were busy, every winter going out making lots of money. Now, I see Brebeuf as the flip side of that, where you have an assault on an indigenous culture, direct, targeted. This is not a business book, so I won't sit there looking for my nomination for a Canadian Business Book Award or a Canadian Historical Business Book Award, but it is a book about the very, very beginnings of Canada and fitting together with Radisson. I do an Anglo pronunciation of all these names because I'm not going to brutalize them with my French. But I wanted to say how we got off on the feet we got off on, and there were actually several feet involved. So now I'm going to actually talk about what I came to talk about. And so a while ago, I picked up a used copy of Jack Granatstein's 1999 book, Who Killed Canadian History. It's such a memorable book that when I got it home, I found that I already had a copy. But I kept it in the bathroom for some time because, its destruction would not be a major loss to the world. And the book, I looked at the book. It was published by Anna Porter, who published me, and the loss of Anna Porter as a publisher, key porter, was a huge setback to Canadian business writing, Canadian political writing. The loss of her company. Anna's still quite among us, trust me. And she's a vibrant person who works like crazy, but not in publishing. So anyway, Jack made money and Anna made money, and people talked about what was going on in Canadian history in 1999. Now, Granatstein, but anyway, Granatstein's take on it was that social history, women's history, was poisoning the well for political history and business history and military history and stuff. And I think people were right in some ways to see that as crankery and regression. That social history was ignored in Canada. People have every right to research it. People should research it. It is part of the history that weaves into political history, business history, military history. You can't tell the story of the Second World War in Canada without talking about the families, especially the wives. When you realize, like, you look at books like Jeffrey Keshin's, oh my God, I like on his book. Jeffrey Keshin did a study of the Second World War, where he looked at families, juvenile delinquency, he looked at divorce, all of the things that would show the damage done by the removal of all of these men, especially father figures in the war, and remind us of things like the famous picture of New Westminster, where the men are marching down the hill and the little boy is running up and he's touching his father. But very rarely will anyone tell you that actually his wife wrote him a Dear John letter, and that boy's family broke up because of the war. Anyway, so one of the things that Jack didn't do was talk about where the training of historians is coming from, if any, anymore. And I sort of slipped in under the wire. I was deluded into thinking that when when the sort of baby boomer people who are older than me, I guess I'm on the tail end of it, retired, there would be jobs for profs. And that turned out to be a myth. But I still believe, and I've always believed, that history is it's an academic field that opens up all kinds of doors, both in terms of employment and in terms of the way you use your mind. And there are lots of jobs in history, and you'll never hear anyone say that. You use history in law. I mean, law is history. You go on to Canley, you find the cases, you read the cases, you analyze the material using the structure of law, but there's all kinds of fact. You synthesize it, and then you usually end up writing something down, which is an awful lot of what historians do. You use law in policy management, policy advisement, and there are tons of people, let's say law, that use history in that. And there are people who I did my PhD with in the early 2000s who now work as policy advisors in government. There are people who I know who are working in military strategy. I know two military historians who went through and got their doctorates. You use it, of course, in teaching, in archaeology, and I'm talking about the area of archaeology that is actually the growth area, which is the archaeological report writing and surveying of potentially destroyed archaeological sites. And of course, you can use it in things like climate studies and use it in book publishing and editing. Now, I'm really lucky. I get to write without being pestered. I have an extremely supportive family. And I married into a family of academics, which kind of helps. And so far, I've written books about Great Lakes shipwrecks, wartime censorship. I've written about cannabis before it was legalized. And I still don't believe that happened, by the way. Of course, Radisson and the fur trade. I've written about the world of the 1930s in Ontario, which is very similar to this world. We've had populist governments. You had agenda-driven news coverage. You had extremely powerful people sitting on top of information distribution. It's hauntingly like the period that we're in now. And I hope that some of you actually read it. The typical high school teacher and student tends to think that history isn't really important. You have math and science, and you have sort of story time. And the media in this country has pretty much the same belief that Canadian history is story time, but it's dull story time. And I have seen so many book reviews, including reviews of my own, that start off with the line or have the line in them. I thought Canadian history was boring until I read blah, blah, blah. Now, quite often that is the first book this person's ever read in Canadian history. So they thought it was dull, they read a book, it changed their mind, and they probably never read another book. But we don't see too many of these anymore anyway, because the newspapers have got rid of all of their, not all their, overbroad, but certainly most newspapers have got rid of their book pages, and even the ones that still have them use papers like the Montreal Gazette and the Ottawa Citizen almost always use American wire copies, so you might as well not have them. The Globe and Mail shrank their book pages, and the excuse for all this was that publishers don't buy ads in papers. They didn't see it as a good newspaper that has credibility as a top tier paper for intelligent people would have book pages. They kind of lost the plot on that. One of the really weird things about media people, having been around them for so much of my life, is how few of them actually have any real idea of what they have and any real belief in what they do. And a lot of book publishers have decided that Canadian history is fairly boring too. And we're seeing that especially in the four big American publishers that are here. It's very, very hard to get a good book deal in Canadian history unless you have a big name. And there are a handful of people with big names, and there are people who you think have big names who do not have the clout now to get a book deal with HarperCollins or whatever. And it's not because HarperCollins doesn't want the money, or Random House or Hachette or or Simon & Schuster. It's because the Canadian market is so minimal that basically book deals can be handed out as favors, as opposed to doing a book because it's going to make some money. You could sell, you know, like a great Canadian bestseller, not Jordan Peterson level, but somewhere down in the a couple months in the bestseller, and it won't really change the bottom line of one of these companies in Canada, because what they're in the business of is importing. Now, Canadian nonfiction books, according to Susan Swan, who did a study of this before COVID, so I'd expect that things probably haven't improved, that in Canada, nonfiction books account for less than 4% of the entire book market in Canada. Now, these are Canadian nonfiction books, so books written by people here, by professors, by people who write cookbooks, by people who write about bird watching, the backroads of Newfoundland, Jordan Peterson, me, ghostwritten political autobiographies account for 4% of the Canadian book trade. And to me, that's obscene. I can't imagine a developed country anywhere in the world that would accept that as okay, that would not have at least a conversation about that. Now, we do have certain impediments to a thriving Canadian industry, being easily, you can truck books easily into Canada from the States. It doesn't help us much, but come on, I've spoken to people from Germany about this. I've spoken to people who are in France about this, and it just blows them away that the Canadian government just lets this happen. Now, I'm going to get a little political. If you believe the country is a post-nationalist state, or believe that Canadian content is unimportant and that we are part of sort of an American project, so I've basically thrown a big blanket over two of our major political movements in this country, then you can end up with a situation like this with nobody talking about it. And does academia talk about it? Well, not really, because academics aren't in the business of selling books. Or, as long as books get published in academic presses, because they have unique areas of funding, unique sources of funding, they're not caught up in this as much as the commercial book industry. There are great academic books in Canada. There are fantastic academic writers. The problem is, and this is something that I've believed for years, is that academics, especially in this environment that we have, this sort of post-truth environment, have more of an obligation than they ever have to try to connect with readers everywhere. There is no point in a fraternity or colloquium of people writing for each other at mostly public expense, because it really doesn't help Canada. And for academic people to say, my books are too sort of high tone for the average reader, well, that's fine. Most books are, but at least try to write something. And there are brilliant academic authors who can write. And there are many academic authors who can't. And there are many academic editors who can't edit. Anyway, the reason I want authors to connect with readers is not because I want them to make lots of money, because in Canada it's not possible practically, but it's because we are living in this country that is building very quickly. We have one of the oldest democracies in the world. It's certainly, I guess, with the UK and the United States, an extremely long functioning democracy that that I believe is under threat. And I have views of time and space that are almost spiritual. I believe that you cannot be happy unless you have at least some feeling of home, what the Germans would call Heimat. And I think that you have to know where you sit in terms of space and time. So when we make decisions, when we choose governments, when we choose business options, when we interact with newcomers to Canada, when we interact with Indigenous people, we have to understand what's happened in time. And we can't go forward unless the decisions we make are based on an understanding of the past. But right now, and this is not a problem that's just in Canada, there is a severe issue of students studying history and studying the history that's offered. And this is something that came up this year. It really surprised me. And I'm not sure this is happening at every university, but if it is, this should be quite scary, is the number of people that we're seeing showing up to do graduate work in history has fallen off a cliff. At the University of Ottawa, there were 5 graduate students for the entire history department. That's masters and PhDs this year. That meant that they had to chop up the TA jobs and only have a few hours for each prof, rather than have TAs assigned to profs who, under their collective agreements, were entitled to have a TA, to the point where some profs said, look, I'm not going to bother, have somebody come in for 4 hours. Well, they're going to read the syllabus and stuff. I mean, I just forget it. I'll do the work. Then I thought, well, maybe it's just U of O, Harvard on the Riel. And then I checked and I found that Queen's have 6 grad students in history. So these grad students, that doesn't mean they're doing Canadian history or Canadian political history or even Canadian social history or anything to do with Canada. These are grad students. And so that leaves us with a problem. One of the reasons there are so few of these folks is because there aren't jobs, real jobs. There are gig jobs. At the University of Ottawa, half of the history courses are taught by sessional lecturers. Sessional lecturers, basically people who freelance, who do one course at a time, are not part of the faculty of graduate studies, which means they do not mentor graduate students and they don't supervise PhDs and MAs. They come in, they teach, they leave. That's their job. And they can't, even if they want to. Well, they kind of can, but it's very, very unusual. My mother-in-law is retired. They still pull her into, but she's never been a sessional. She's always been a really high prof, very respected anthropologist. So, so if we don't have people who are trained in historiography, now you can take that training writing about the urban forest, or you can write about, you can study any kind of social history pretty much, and you can learn historiography. But if we only have 5 or 6 people who may or may not actually be doing archival work in Canada, at universities that used to have so many more, then obviously we're going to see a shortage of people who have the training that it takes to do really good business history writing, political history writing. And it gets back to this business of rebuilding Macaulay's papers. I look at that small group of people, I look at the ones that I've met, and I don't think too many people could do that and would even know where to start. Would know the canon, would know the political canon, would know the media history canon, would know the business history canon. When they came across names like Joseph Flavel or William Wright or Harry Oakes or whatever, they're like, who? Who are the people that could possibly write a book like this in 20 years? Where will they come from? They're not going to come from another country. We're not training them here, I'm afraid. Now, Charlotte Gray, who's much easier to be around than Jack Granstein, God, I hope he's not here, wrote a piece in the Globe and Mail a while back about the problem of that kind of commercial history that she writes. And Charlotte does what Charlotte does really well. One of the things that Charlotte decided to do was that she wasn't going to write only Canadian history anymore. So her last book was actually a book about the mothers of Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill. I'm not even sure that did all that well, because it's very hard for Canadian authors to break into an American market, no matter how good they are. And Margaret Macmillan was able to do it, but then her grandfather, her great-grandfather was, pardon? No. Lloyd George. Yeah. So she had that in, plus she has the Oxbridge accent, the whole bit. And no, Charlotte does too. But she's certainly, she's not a relation of Lloyd George. And I'm not too sure how well her book did, and I'm not too sure whether she'll even want to bother again. I'm meeting an awful lot of writers who are saying, no, I'm not going to do it anymore. No. It's like me quitting Twitter. I'm not going to do it anymore. I'm not going to, and then say, well, let's sneak back in. What are they saying? And you can find me on CBC's website saying, I'm not going to write Canadian history anymore. Of course, I wrote a book about Brebeuf, right? Afterwards. Partly on a bet, partly on a dare, because an agent said nobody would buy a book about Brebeuf. And I said, for Christ's sake, we sold all these books about Radisson. Nope, and except for the hotel, nobody really knew who Radisson was. Radisson's a gooseberry, so yeah, brilliant. And Brebeuf, I mean, if you're Catholic, you know who he is. If you're from Montreal, you've heard of him at least. And they have like 400,000 people go up to Midland every summer to see where they worked. And no, this is the story of the Orenda, except it's not. It's actually the right story. This is the story of Black Robe. So again, the Hurons don't just curse and swear and act like asses. They actually are people with agency and intelligence who ask some pretty damn interesting questions to these Jesuits. And I said, yeah, of course people would buy a book about that. I didn't really want to write it at first. He's not the most sympathetic character, but then neither is Radisson or McCullough, so maybe I should write about something nice. But I expect, I expect the book to do. I'll be really surprised if it does super poorly. I ended up going with another agent, and we got a deal for it, and it's being translated. Another one of my law clients who owes me is going to do that. And but we have a lot of Canadian history that's never been written about, especially Quebec, modern Quebec. My God, there are some good books that you'll find in Montreal, and some in Ottawa from Quebec writers, Anglophone and Francophone Quebec writers. And a lot of the Francophone publishing, by the way, I should have said this right at the beginning, is completely different from what I've talked about so far. It is alive and well and living in Montreal and Quebec and Sherbrooke and the Beauce and all kinds of beautiful places. But there has never been a really good book on the referendums of 1980 or 1995. And I'm not sure that it would ever be written. And if it was written, I'm not sure it would be published. And one of the problems, as I wander around coming back to various points, is that, say we write a book, all this, we write a book, we have an agent or we don't need one. And we find a publisher, which is not that hard. There are way too many publishers in Canada, but we can find a publisher who's decent, and we will do a good job and produce a book that's not all screwed up and the pages are out of order. Like poor Richard Doyle's book about the Globe and Mail. It breaks my heart. That man was such a genius and an editor of impeccable skill. And then his book comes out of the Globe and Mail, and a whole bunch of pages are out of order, and they will not fix it. Yeah, and somewhere in wherever in the great newsroom in the sky, Richard Doyle's throwing hay bombs. But anyway, say that doesn't happen to our book, and they print 1,000 copies. and your publisher, XYZ publisher, gets those 1,000 copies, or they go to U of T press for distribution, which happens with a lot of small publishers, and then what? And that's a big part of the problem. Because getting that book from wherever it ends up after it comes back from the printer to the eyes of the reader, and having them hear about it in the media landscape that we have, with like no book pages, no electronic media stuff. I mean, last couple of books I wrote, I didn't even have to go to these morning breakfast things and have some airhead go, "What's your book about?" Which has happened to me, by the way. And I've had fun with it too. I've been almost cruel. But this pen is made out of hemp. Is it really? No. Anyway, so yeah, the getting people to know about your book is very, very difficult. That's where organizations like this really come in handy. There aren't that many of them, of course, but when I get the newsletter, and I am a member, and if I'm not paid up, let me know, because I did vote to adjourn. I always vote to adjourn. Organizations like this can get the word out, but there aren't very many. And when I sat and listened to your discussion on the finances and stuff, I realized that so many of them are much more ad hoc than this, and far less likely to survive in terms of organization, and many of them are quite local. Now, when I do talk to writers about this, I find that they all, not all of them, because I'm not God or some sort of incredible genius, but a sizable number, a very, very large number, have come to the same conclusion I have about the situation. And Brian Bethune, who used to be the Maclean's books editor, interviewed me about this for a piece he's doing for University Affairs. I don't know if it's come out yet. I'm not in a place where I can pick up the freebies anymore. But it is starting to get talked about. And I talked to people at the Riel Club. I was at the Riel Club in Ottawa. This whole club thing is starting to get into my life. In a room with about 20 people, and I swear to God, I was the only person in the room who didn't have the Order of Canada. There were 3 former governors of the Bank of Canada, a former prime minister, several like top tier journalists, the former president of Carleton University, and several other people, quite a few other people who are quite wired in. And some of them had come to the same conclusion that I had, and some of them were like, I had no idea. And then, of course, being Ottawa, it was like, well, who would be the person to go to talk about this? And the problem is, right now, nobody, right? Right now, it's if you went to Ottawa to the Ministry of Canadian Heritage and said, I really think you should be funding more business history, or the Canada Council, if you got out of there with a coffee that was any cooler than it went in, I would be so surprised. It's really about, these days, memoirs. The idea that art only comes from telling your own story. Well, thank God, Great Bus story is not my story, because that would hurt way more than I could take. I think Canada's story is my story. I think my ancestors who lived in Canada, came to Canada, and embraced Canada, embraced a Canadian story. And in my Brave Buff book, I actually have an ancestor who fights with Brave Buff, which is very cool. I'm like, go Nick. It's Nicholas Marcellet, who's one of Champlain's interpreters, is one of my ancestral grandfathers, and he gets in a fight with Champlain about this sort of pervy idea that Champlain has of taking some little indigenous girls to France with him, and Marcellet's like, no, you're not, because he was a big friend of the Inuit Runkelbit. So anyway, I don't want this to be a whine, and like I said, I think all of these problems are fixable. For one thing, nobody has developed an online book presence yet. So why haven't we got somebody, and I know a few people have started to try, like people like Stephen Beattie, who's a reviewer, who's done a lot of reviews for Quill Inquirer, Toronto Star, Globe and Mail, is doing reviews, but of course it's only him. So, it would be good to have some sort of online page or publication that delved more into Canadian books. Quill Inquirer still exists, but it really doesn't do that. And we could look at funding issues. Of course, we would all love SSHRC to get more money. And I'm sure that's going to be in the next budget, likely, maybe. And what I think we really need to do is push for SSHRC to be able to fund people who are not full-time tenured faculty. In other words, people who are sessionals, people who are not working in academia at all, but have the skills of an academic at the level that SSHRC funds should be eligible for SSHRC funding. That is such heresy, I do know. And I think the Canada Council really needs to get mucked out. It's nice that they get to fund the books they like. Unfortunately for them, Canada Council is not set up to be the funding agency for a clique, and that's what's going on there now. I am wrapping this up. I'm probably, I don't want the hook. I really don't. I know what happens here. I know what happened to Brebeuf, and I know what will happen to me if I go too long. Anyway, I do believe we're not a country unless we have a history. And outside of Quebec, it's really easy for people to see this as some sort of town alias, some sort of motel, this nation, but I do believe it's a lot more than that. I think that Canadians, I have a lot of faith in Canadians to solve problems once they understand them. I really do. I'm kind of rare in that way. And I will continue to write and continue to tell stories as long as I can. As long as my wife has a job, I'll keep going. And or we have a pension or whatever. And if I start to get kind of senile, which you may think I already am, the writing may become more interesting. I'm kind of like the old man that Hunter S. Thompson runs into in Peru when it comes to books. Hunter S. Thompson's traveling through Peru in the 1960s. He comes across this guy, and he's got a stick for a plow and some kind of animal pulling the thing. And Thompson says to him, like, "Why don't you get a steel plow?" And he says, "Well, this is my plow. This is what I use. This is what steel plows are wonderful things, and the people who use them, good luck to them. But I'll continue to use my own little wooden plow." And that is the way I see book writing in this country. And I hope that the takeaways that you have from this are buy Canadian books. It's nice to get them for free. The Canadian book industry, this is going to be quite startling, I think, for a lot of people. The overall industry, the one that we have 4% of, people like us, it's never been hit by the internet. The magazines, yes. Newspapers, music, because they all gave it away, but nobody gave books away. And book sales in Canada are fine. And I'm not carping on people to read more books. Kids are reading lots of books. University students, not so much, because they're reading course packs and things. And they're reading papers, and they're reading websites, and a lot of them are cribbing Wikipedia and all that kind of stuff. But people grow into it. If they're readers, they're readers. If they're not, they're not. And you really can't, you can't whip people into becoming readers. But I think a lot of the really good children's and young adult books that have been written, which are way better than the ones where when I was a kid, have made a lot of readers among young people. And I haven't taught for a while, but I'm utterly impressed by young people today. I think they get a really crappy rap from media and from lots of people, but they are engaged and they are intelligent, and they, not every one of them. Some of them are, on meth. Some of them are in jail. But most of you, I take it, have students, and I would expect that you're quite impressed by your students. And even though there's so many more students than were in schools when I was a kid, and even years later when you were a kid, we were in small classes. Not everybody got to go to university, but we have a large number of people going to university, and most of them, you wouldn't think they belong there, but most of them do. And then there are some, of course, you go like, well, obviously this place lets in anybody, but and then you have to teach to that. And of course, that becomes a challenge. So I'm going to leave it at that. If anybody has any questions that do not involve me vetting their book for libel for free, I'll be glad to take them, and leave it at that.
Any questions for Mark? Please go ahead, both online and in the room. Are there any questions for Mark? Jeremy, and then Ryan, go ahead.
How much of this do you think, because you study history, how much of this do you think is cyclical? And will we see a bounce? And are we at the trough yet? Like, is this the worst that it's going to get? Or like, when you look back in history, it feels like history as a topic ebbs and flows. Mm-hmm. Right now, people are very sort of pessimistic and.
I think it goes in tandem with Canadian nationalism, right? So we see, I think you see that and Canadian social values and what it's considered to be worth talking about and what is considered to be old hat and who makes those decisions. But I think when you look back on the days, and they weren't perfect by any stretch, but when Jack McClellan and those guys were in the publishing business, and they Mel Hurtig, and were able and willing to put their own money into things that end up being turkey projects, like like the first, like Hurtig's encyclopedia, or the Encyclopedia of Newfoundland, which is that Joey Smallwood worked on. That was just a disaster. It does ebb and flow. People think we don't have any history anymore. We kind of bought into this idea in '89 that history was over, but we are up to our eyeballs in history right now, and things are changing. The ground is shifting underfoot so quickly and so unpredictably, because you can run a whole pile of scenarios that can either lead us to back to calm waters or to insane craziness right now. Plus, war is spreading throughout the world, and war without rules, war that is cruel, is spreading throughout the world. And one of the things that disturbs me a lot is that had war spread like this in the 90s, you would see people marching for peace. And what you see now is people marching for their side. And that is scary.
I was curious, you've seen the landscape shift dramatically over the, past couple of decades, and one of those roles that you kind of mentioned in your speech was the role of the university press as like an institution within this. And you kind of noted it had special status. So curious, has the role of the university press aggrandized? Has it depleted? How has it shifted? And are there other players in that ecosystem that sort of should be stepping up?
I think the people who should be stepping up are people who produce high-end books that aren't academic books, and that's not happening. So you're seeing places, the big American houses actually losing people who actually sold books. If you read, I'm not going to name it. Well, it's just a twist in my arm. What's it? And I'm drawing a blank. Okay. There are serious military historians, especially, who cannot get book deals anymore, even though they've sold thousands upon thousands upon thousands of books. And if you read Gray's piece, she talks to Ted Barris, who's gone from HarperCollins to Sutherland House, which is published by Sutherland House is owned by a guy who used to be the editor of the National Post in the Plains. That is God, I hope he's not watching. That is a big drop. Okay, it's not a prestigious house. It's not a house that's going to sell any books for Ted. And Barris has sold tons of books. And when Barris comes into a room, it's a brass band up there. It's an amazing show. and he does it like 3 times a week. So this is a guy who not only writes books itself, he goes out and he busts his butt to sell them. So like, if those kind of, if like well-researched books that really aren't academic books, but are published for, say, the large group of people who are military buffs, can't be published by the big houses, and they don't really belong in academic presses usually, because they're sort of one-dimensional. Who's going to publish them and get them out? Because that is a big group of people who want to read about that stuff. The academic presses well, I had one book published by an academic press, but it was in the States. But it was a book that was meant for a general audience, and it was published by the University of Michigan Press. And that does happen here. I think the university presses probably will see some of the writing on the wall in terms of their own funding, and want to be more relevant. I have nothing negative to say about the academic press in this country, because I think it publishes books that nobody would publish, and B, they're good books. Now whether students read them anymore, well, that's a problem, because if you have like I had a paper in a book, the Terry Kopp book. I suspect that's in all kinds of course packs and things, right? Anybody studying censorship, it's a book. They don't buy my book on censorship, they just take the paper. That's a problem. So then we get into access copyright. And where, the money for access copyright is drying, because the universities fought it. And the university said, taking a chapter is fair use. So, kids aren't buying academic press books.
Open access is a problem in terms of, like, if Shirk gives you the money, then you have to show up with, you have to make it accessible, which is very challenging for publishers in that regard. I know that there's another question from Joe, and then Paul, and then Sanjeev.
For sharing, I've read Renaissance, I've read McCullough, I will buy her book now.
Great, thank you.
But on McCullough, for me, I'm originally a Bourrie boy, and I didn't discover the Globe until '56. I didn't come to Toronto until '68. But one of the things I got out of it was just learning that incredible story. Just so you know, related. You remember the name John Bracken?
Absolutely. There's only one biography. It took me years to find it, literally.
That was one of my high school mates wrote it.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't know if you remember the line in there, but when Bracken became national leader, he had to deal with McCullough.
Yes, he did.
And he said, and he was a farmer by background. He was well, he said, I'd sooner do a hard weekend work on the farm than spend 10 minutes on the phone with George McCullough.
There's that other great line where Bracken had left. Bracken had left his position as head of the Tories, and had taken a job as a $1 a year man for King, and he was doing something connected to it. It was the Air Force, and it's in the book. And McCullough and him are standing next to each other in the Riel Club washroom in the urinals. And McCullough says, well, how do you like working with those sons of bitches? And he says, it's a lot better working with the sons of bitches I used to be with.
Yeah, I was just wondering how much of a factor in climate history publishing you think is cancel culture and the tendency to look at the past as a cauldron of sin and shame, and history is just a chronicle of colonization.
Thanks for just tossing me into the goddamn grinder. I really appreciate that. There's going to be an element of that. There's an element of sort of original sin it's of course based on thinking that there are plus people and there are minus people in this world, and that these are peoples, so that you can have entire nations and races of people who are pluses and who are minuses. Of course, that's absurd thinking. So if you apply that to history, then you have absurd history. It's important to tell the story. And God knows if anyone, people are going to call my Brave Buff book woke. But you know, that stuff was left out. The books that were written about Brave Buff were written by Jesuits and nobody else, were fictionalized because people did not want to tell the real story. The real story was distressing, and it was not always a good thing. And French Canada is built on the foundation that there were these priests who went out there doing God's work and were brutally murdered by these Iroquois who were enemies of the faith, who were enemies of New France, who Madeline de Verchères has to fight against and keep, keep out, thank you, of the fort she's in, who are allied with the Brits, and then of course the Brits come out of the shadow and they become the oppressors, and this flows through Abbe Gros, and it flows through Quebec historical discourse unto this day, right? Because now Mogul and Concordia are, with their multinational student bodies and their anglophones, are the Iroquois that killed Brebeuf. Like, there's always got to be somebody, right? So, God, I know I'm wandering around. So what I'm saying is, these stories have to be told that there were screw-ups in Canada, and then you've got people who tend to be right of center saying, well, yeah, but it wasn't always that bad. And then it becomes, it goes personal. You're just a denialist. You're, well, you're uber woke. And of course, it begins to fit into the society that we live in, where the middle is disappearing, and we've just got, two big groups of nuts going at it. That will change, I think, partly because none of these books sell, except the real screwy stuff that Ezra Levant puts out about convoys. It doesn't make money hand over fist and that stuff. But I hope that historians will embrace the idea that you can have a guy like Brebeuf or anybody else who did terrible things for reasons they thought that were right, and used, in getting into the decision yesterday on the convoy, used what they knew at the time in their decision-making process, and yeah, it's tough, and it's. If Granite Steen was here today, I'm sure he'd talk about the whole sort of woke thing and the whole cancel culture thing and stuff. And it's a lot easier to get it on the CBC if the stuff is very sort of anti-traditional story of Canada. Now, because of the generosity of a friend, I'm staying at the Albany Club. So if you want to know where all the John A. Macdonald's pictures and statues went, that's where they went. The place is full of them. I'm going to tell you, do I have like 5 minutes to tell a story? Okay, I'm going to tell you a story that breaks my heart, and this is something that we do need to fix. I have a friend, and my friend loves politicians the way bird watchers love birds. And it doesn't matter who. Jimmy Carter stayed at his house. He was a good friend of John Turner. He's in Kingston. He would pick up John Turner, pour him up when he was poured off the train, put him in his car, drive him to the Holiday Inn on the waterfront in Kingston, throw a couple more drinks into him, kind of get that maintenance level, and take him up to Queens for his Board of Governors meetings. He wrote speeches for Harper, but he was a friend of Chrétien's. He knows personally every prime minister in Canada. He wrote Brian Mulroney's autobiography. He did a collection of speeches of Laurier. He did a collection of speeches of Macdonald. So, and then he was working for the Kingston Whig Center. Arthur, that's right, Arthur. So Arthur gets a call one day, City of Kingston. Sir John A. Macdonald's 200th birthday is coming up. And Arthur, public-spirited, history-minded, politician-loving man that he is, says, what can I do to help? By the time they were finished with him, and a lot of this had to do with Queen's faculty, history faculty, he did not answer his phone for a year. He was, in a lot of emotional and mental health trouble. He's back on his feet, thank God, or I wouldn't tell this story. At one point, his therapist said, get a job in a restaurant so you at least interact with people again. And this was a guy who everybody loves, right? I mean, to know this man is to love him. I gave him a copy of Prime Minister Trudeau's book with Head. I got them to sign it and I gave it to him as a wedding present. And that was like, oh my God. This is a man who loves history, and he doesn't have, even though he wrote speeches for Harper and more in his autobiography, he was going to write Turner's. He's not a partisan man. He's one of the very few people I know who's sort of from the Ottawa bubble, actually from Scarborough, I'm proud of it, but who was in the Ottawa bubble, who actually just has great respect for anybody who embraces public service, which is really rare these days, that kind of respect. And, it's a warning to us all of how bad things can get. And I really worry about people who are tenure track but not tenured, and, the exit they walk on. At the same time, we don't want things run by the Jordan Petersons of the world either, where people are just too rude, too ignorant, too mean to treat people with respect, to even consider that there's any point of view other than their own. And so I know I sound totally wishy-washy, and I do see myself as very much a centrist. But I think, when I do books like McCullough, and which is really a book about populism, when I did Radisson, which is a book about contact and how actually sometimes it worked, when I did Brebeuf, I cite things up to the eyeballs because I know that I have to be ready if someone takes a run at this work. And I know that when people do take a run at historians, they often do it without good faith, and they don't do it with truth. They don't do it truthfully.
Yeah, so thank you for the last question. Thank you for this session. This is an eye-opener for me. One observation and one question. So one observation is during this one, I also noticed that there are various factors which raises interest in history. One is the political discourse of the country at that time, naturalism, and war. And all these three lenses, I think in Canada at this point, we are in a state where we are trying to play soft along all these three lenses. Our nationalism is soft, our politics is very soft, no one is speaking, at least sites is from the.
We've stopped talking about peacekeepers, by the way, but.
Talking about it, right? And then it's not encouraged, even in schools, even in workplace, these things are not encouraged. So that's one factor, that's an observation. Second one, my question is, what I've noticed is the lack of good journalism also impacts history, the amount of history you read. Because for me, the best feed for which books should I be reading in history come from economics or Wall Street Journal. None of the Canadian, you're absolutely correct, none of the Canadian newspapers have that column now as expanded, but the international newspapers have still maintained that. So I think my observation is there's a lack of good journalism now in Canada, which is indirectly impacting what should we be reading, especially on history. So, I
would give the Literary Review of Canada a chance. You don't see it anywhere because nobody sells magazines anymore. And the one of the problems in terms of journalism too, and I didn't get into it, but Charlotte does in the piece in the Globe and Mail, and everybody should pay for at least one paper, by the way, is that that magazines themselves were the place where people learned to write long. If they weren't academics and they weren't learning how to write long articles and pieces of, a PhD thesis, you learned, Pierre Burton learned how to write on magazines, and Peter Newman learned how to write on magazines, and then, people who became these great sort of myth makers of Canadian nationalism cut their teeth because they had space to write in magazines. So we don't have that. But yeah, we don't have those book pages. And it's a huge disservice, and I don't understand. And I actually tried to have this conversation with the publisher of the Globe and Mail. I thought I had kind of an in with the McCullough book, which they were very generous about. I got to give them credit for that. But saying, like, if you're going to have a classy paper, if you're going to have a paper that has intellectual heft, well, you got to start with book pages. People read books. But again, I think some of these people who run these organizations wouldn't buy the paper themselves if they didn't work there. It sort of got to that point, and so I was trying to talk in my talk about maybe the other options that we have are to go online and have people writing a lot more reviews in an online publication that's either got a paywall or even better doesn't, and try to get funding for something like that, so that people can at least find out these books exist. And the people finding out these books exist include the independent retailers who are becoming more and more part of the market again as people lose faith in indigo.
I think you have given us a purpose for the organization to double down on.
Well, I'm glad I've given your life a purpose. I thought the purpose was finance, and it looked pretty good to me. But no, I'm just joking.
Using that finance for the right outcomes. Right?
Yes.
So one of the outcomes is to encourage Canadians to read more businesses, more history in general.
Yeah.
And that function of it is a business history.
But this is a business history association.
Yeah.
And business history is one of the areas of Canadian research nonfiction that's still doing pretty well. And the one thing I get worried about is that because there's so little money to spend the time on it, that people will get more and more into sponsored books or books that are underwritten by, I think of Doug Hunter and his book on Molson's and Hortons and stuff. And Doug Hunter is a great historian and a fine author, and his books are honest. But I think you'd have a hard time convincing Canadian book buyers that a book that's written about XYZ company where XYZ actually put any money to the book is fair, to the reader and to the company.
Mark, this is going to be the last question. Before, there is, of course, a way that commission history can work.
Yeah.
This is in Germany do it because they were required because of the Nazis. Every firm has to have history.
Ooh, I bet some of those are dandies.
Well, they have a pretty good deal. They have an association called the DUG, which is meant to make sure that those histories are written critically and completely above board, and they're funded by the companies themselves.
And they have.
Just very quickly, I read in commission history in many academics.
Yeah.
So
they can,
Yeah.
run interference.
Yeah.
I just worry.
The purpose of our organization is to set up a house where we can say we'll cut deals where we protect the interests of everybody to make sure that this history is legitimate and is critical and fair, but also meets the needs of corporate history.
I think that's really needed because you have to be able to convince the reader, that the book is, that you haven't left anything out. If you're writing about Siemens, Jesus, there's so much you can, yeah, Thyssen,
any of the Germans.
Yeah, Mercedes, Hugo Boss. Oh, everyone likes a nice black suit.
Yes, they are. And in addition to that, I think they're the most global generation ever. And I'm curious to know, what you think of the fact that this is the lack of Canadian history is a function of the very sort of community competitiveness. And I say that because a lot of young people are, yes, our universities are full of real. But a lot of Canadians are going to study abroad. And a lot of Canadians are taking opportunities to intern at the EU or going to China. And many of them, once they experience that, the university in the US, and they make their lives there because coming back here, as a summer student, they look at the Amazon warehouse.
Yeah.
Whereas if they're going to Columbia or Yale, they're going to get a summer position at the Brookings or maybe as an intern on Capitol Hill, which is far more exciting than watching somebody in the box.
Yeah, or even getting a job on Parliament Hill.
Exactly.
Though I would say that they don't have to go to Columbia or Princeton to get a great education, get one here, and then get one in McGill. But we've always had valued that forward education in terms of Canadians going abroad. Mackenzie King, who's the only prime minister, by the way, who's ever had a PhD, got it at Harvard, right? Or did he get it at Chicago? Chicago, but I went to Harvard and then he went to Chicago because I guess he just couldn't make the cut at Harvard. Anyway.
Well, they offered it in the first deanship of the business school.
Okay. So they, well, actually, he was right in terms of what happened to his life. So I think we might have to see that the world in a global way too, and people like Charlie Gray talking about doing books, Canadian books that are books by Canadian authors that have like a larger worldview are important. I think we've always had a lot of people who come through Canada. We look at immigration numbers that come in. We never look at immigration numbers of people who leave. And Toronto, during the Irish famines in the 1840s, there were scads of immigrants that came to Toronto. They don't tell you they got on the Grand Trunk and kept going to Detroit, right? I mean, that was pretty much the norm. We had all these immigrants from the country. And people who do go abroad, I think they, in China or the United States these days, would probably value Canadian values perhaps more than they might have a few years ago as things get progressively weirder in those places.
Yes, but
well, that's it. We don't have teaching opportunities. We don't have writing opportunities. Our publishing is completely undercapitalized. I'm going to say something I didn't want to say, but as a judge on the Writers' Trust Awards for nonfiction, and I got 110 books, and probably 70 should not have been published. They just weren't good enough to even, I thought, to be published. We publish a lot of direct. We don't focus. But Canadians are really cheap in capital investment. You can look at everything from 24 Sussex and the rebuilding of Parliament Hill, which has now cost more than the Montreal Olympics cost, by the way, just for the center block. People don't know that. That's going to be a hell of a story when people start to figure that one out. We can't. Jack Gardner, I don't know if you know who he is, but he's a bit of a public intellectual. He's a master's in history and a law degree. And he used to advise Trudeau, but I don't think he does anymore. He said, we can't continue to live in the back shed of the United States and just live off them. Like, we just can't. It's unsustainable as a country. It's not good for us. It's not good for the Americans. Thank God they don't notice. And unless we actually have sort of a national identity and national program and invest in this country, we're screwed. So much of our money investment went into real estate. It sucked up, you guys are the economists. How much of the capital of this country was drained into real estate at the expense of corporate plant? A huge amount. And it's a crapshoot. When the music stops, there's going to be a lot of people who aren't going to get chairs. And the levels of debt in this country for things that are not of any use to anybody are horrible. And the government of Canada can't capitalize things anymore. It doesn't have the money, and Canadian banks, are not listening to entrepreneurs who would look at new businesses. Could you launch a BlackBerry today? Could you walk in and say, I've got a list of of really good authors. Here's their books. They're all really good books. I want to start a publishing company and see how far you get at CIBC. Like, again, your coffee would still be warm when you left, you know? Yes, very much more. Yeah, because you got into hell for a moment, so.
And if they gave you a deal, hell would have frozen over and your coffee.
Well, yeah, and the devil will be around to collect too, so.
How about a round of applause for Mark Bourrie? Engaging stuff, really thoughtful stuff, and encourage people to, when it's posted on our YouTube channel, so take a look and spread the word, because for your students out there, your colleagues, your friends, anybody who's interested and cares about what's going on in Canada, this was a really thoughtful and well-given talk. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay, great.
And so nice to meet you, person.
Yes, okay. And with that, I will say that the 9th annual general meeting of the Canadian Business History is going to come to a close. Thank you very much, and we'll see you with lots of activities in 2024.